When Jonathan found a very weak-looking skin-colored monkey in the forest, his first instinct was to bring it to a local vet to help it out. But he would soon realize that this was a big mistake. He was not dealing with a monkey at all, and should have just left it right where he found it. But it was too late for that now. The reaction from the vet had made Jonathan even more sure about his suspicions. He had not rescued a monkey from the forest. This was something very different, and is about to get the confirmation he was looking for. The vet came back out of the office, but he did not have the little creature with him. He looked concerned when he put a hand on Jonathan's shoulder and told him, "I know it's not your fault, but you made a big mistake." Jonathan's jaw dropped as the vet started explaining himself. All he had wanted to do was help this poor animal, but he should have just left it alone. But what kind of animal did Jonathan rescue from the forest? And why would it have been better if he had just left it there alone? Jonathan has been an animal lover. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and click the notification bell for more amazing stories, for as long as he can remember. Today wouldn't be the first time he was on a rescue mission for an animal in need. He loved nature and would often walk through the woods, and, like so many other times, today was a day he'd be a helper to an animal in need. But things aren't what they seem. Jonathan thought he'd seen it all. After all, he'd rescued dozens of animals, from birds to rodents, lost dogs and cats, and something resembling a wild boar. He didn't like to be called a hero, but deep down, it felt good to help these animals. After all, they were so cute and lovable. How could he refuse to help an animal in need? He was pretty skilled at helping animals. He could identify basic problems and knew a few vets in the city. This also meant he felt pretty confident in his skills at identifying animals, but this time would be different. The most important problem at hand was the baby animal all alone, but the trouble would start soon. While on one of Jonathan's walks through the woods outside of the city, he was sure he heard an animal crying for help. He paused in the woods, waiting to hear it again. It was only a few seconds until he heard the cry again. It was faint, but it was there, and most of all, it sounded like a puppy. But how did a puppy get way out here? Jonathan was determined to find the lost puppy. Listening to the cries and taking careful, soft steps, he made his way through the forest. He thought he'd lost the puppy at one point when the crying stopped. Frightened, he'd gone too far. Jonathan took a few steps back until he heard the soft crying again. It was then that he spotted the little thing. There was a small bed of moss, and laying on top of it was a little white monkey, so young that its eyes hadn't fully opened yet. Jonathan leaned over the poor creature and looked around for other possible puppies. After all, they usually came in bunches. But there was nothing. Jonathan spent a few minutes looking over the little creature, trying to see if it had any wounds of any kind. The monkey seemed fine, except for being alone and probably scared. But was it a monkey? The more he looked at it, Jonathan wasn't sure. And that wasn't the only odd thing here. The small moss bed holding the supposed monkey was strange and looked odd to Jonathan. This wasn't something very likely to be found in nature. Perhaps some animal had built it as a sort of nest, but still, an animal would be messier. This left one very confusing and possibly terrifying conclusion. If it hadn't been an animal, and it wasn't natural, that left one possibility. Humans. The big question was, why would someone come out to the middle of the woods and leave a baby puppy all alone? And was it even a monkey? Jonathan had a lot of questions and no answers, but he knew one thing had to be done. Making a makeshift carrier for the tiny animal out of the cover of his travel bag, he carefully put the puppy inside it. He still had a lot of walking left to go before he'd reach his car, but at least for now, the little thing would be safe and protected from any nasty animals around. Jonathan repeatedly checked on the puppy as he walked back to his car. It threatened to rain, and Jonathan didn't want the little baby to get wet or chill. But the more he looked at the animal, the more curious he got. While he had suspicions of it not being a monkey, he was almost sure. So what was it? The black creature was small and definitely a baby, so it didn't have any distinctive features. It was too young to tell what it was, but the face looked odd. It'd have to be some kind of monkey for it to have a face like that. He couldn't think of any other explanation. It wasn't until further on his walk that Jonathan had another idea. Maybe the animal wasn't native to this forest or area. A monkey wouldn't be native to around here, but at least it would make a bit more sense. How did it get here if the animal wasn't native to this area? Again, the only plausible answer was humans. It didn't really matter what the creature was. Jonathan would look after it and get it the help it needed. A shelter would probably take the monkey, but it must be seen by a vet first. The city was a half-hour's drive away. Jonathan hoped the creature would be okay until then. It was getting darker out. After another few minutes, Jonathan finally reached the parking lot. It didn't take him longer than 2 seconds to figure out something was very, very wrong. The parking lot was completely empty. There wasn't anyone there. That would be normal with the rain coming in, but his car was missing too. Recovering himself, Jonathan walked over to where he was sure he had parked it. Thinking he could be wrong, he quickly walked around the lot and searched for his car. It couldn't have been towed. He parked it right here in this lot. That was perfectly legal. He went back to the first spot and found a single clue. Bending down to the pavement, Jonathan found a lot of broken glass. Small fragments that he had missed earlier. It was evident now that someone had broken into his car and stolen it. They'd had both the time and opportunity. How was he supposed to get back to the city now, and with rain rolling in? The park where he'd been walking wasn't well known, and was off of a fairly quiet road. Lucky for him, Jonathan still has his phone and some battery. He decided to call the police first to report his car being stolen. The baby animal in his pack was important, but his car took priority right now. Jonathan told the police what kind of car he had, the make, the model, where it had been, the license plate, and anything else he thought was important. Police told him they'd keep an eye out for it, but that was all they could do for now. He thanked them and hung up. That was done, but he was still stranded. He thought about getting to his apartment in the city, but the little creature in his pack still needed attention. He needed to get to the vet first and then go home. Unfortunately, the vet's office was in the city, still a half-hour away, and now he didn't even have a car. But it couldn't be that hard to get a ride in today's world, right? Jonathan checked the Uber app first. No one was willing to drive that far out of the city to come and pick him up. Jonathan was willing to pay the price for a ride, but no one was interested. Jonathan tried a taxi service next. He explained his situation, but they told him no too. They were worried it was a scam to rob them and their drivers. This didn't stop Jonathan yet. In a big city, there were several taxi companies, but he lost hope as service after service turned him down. Jonathan was furious after the 6th company refused him. He was desperate, and it was starting to sprinkle rain now. He didn't want to stay in the cold. It was time for something drastic. He was going to hitchhike. While there weren't many cars that came down this road, one would have to come eventually. It was just a matter of time. Thankfully for him, he only had to wait about 10 minutes before a car came turning around the bend. Jonathan thanked his lucky stars and went to work. Jonathan flagged down the car, and once he had their attention, put out his thumb showing he needed a ride. A middle-aged woman rolled down the window of her car. Jonathan explained what had happened to him, that his car had been stolen and he needed a ride into the city. Would she believe him? As luck would have it, she was indeed heading to the city as well, and had no problem picking up Jonathan to go with her. She seemed kind enough and believed his story. He sat in the passenger seat, and from the moment he sat down, he heard a curious noise coming from the back seat of the car. Jonathan sat up, his mind on the animal that was cradled in his arms. Next to him, the woman's Labrador approached the bundle, slowly sniffing around it to figure out what was hidden inside. At first, Jonathan thought the dog smelled like a puppy, and its motherly instinct had kicked in, but he quickly realized how wrong he was. Jonathan smiled at the bigger dog, loosening his grip on the bundle that covered the monkey. He allowed the Labrador to come closer to the bundle. The Labrador was calm, leading Jonathan to believe that the bigger dog would not pose a threat. Opening up the covers to reveal the monkey to the Labrador, Jonathan watched in horror as things got worse. Jonathan only realized his mistake once it was too late. The Labrador took a peek at the monkey and sniffed the tiny animal for a second before suddenly growing alarmingly aggressive. The Labrador began to growl, showing her teeth before quickly getting reprimanded for her behavior by her owner. Jonathan stared in horror before turning away from the bigger dog, who was still visibly upset at the monkey presence. Jonathan sighed in frustration. It was becoming clear that the animal he had picked up in the forest was definitely not a puppy. But was it even a monkey? What the hell had he done? Jonathan closed his eyes as he silently hoped that a vet would be able to shed some light on the situation. Nodding his head, he stared straight with a determined look. He would be heading to a vet first. Clearly, figuring out the animal's identity would need to take priority. Luckily, the lady was kind enough to drop him off. They arrived at the vet shortly after. The lady wished him luck and left him in front of the building. After checking in at the front desk, Jonathan sat in the waiting room, keeping the tiny creature nestled into the bundle to avoid agitating the other animals in the office. However, he showed the animal to the receptionist, who was just as lost as Jonathan. She informed Jonathan that she would be bumping him up the list because the animal looked to be in very bad shape, and she didn't want its presence to upset the other animals. Even with that information, Jonathan was shocked when he heard his name being called only a few minutes later. Jonathan held the animal in his hand, and the vet directed him toward a chair. He narrated the events that had occurred in the forest to the vet, who listened closely and took notes. Occasionally, the vet would ask questions, but the meeting only lasted about 10 minutes before Jonathan was asked to head back into the waiting room. Now that the baby animal was in the vet's care, Jonathan could turn his focus to other important matters. For one, the theft of his car. Jonathan called the police to report the theft of his car and was shocked to hear that he would need to be transferred to another department. Thankfully, this was because they had found his car. Apparently, the thief had ridden into town with the broken window, and a police officer spotted the vehicle and stopped it for a routine check. When the driver could not provide his information, the thief and the car were taken into custody, and Jonathan called in moments later. Jonathan was surprised to hear all his information, but he was glad things had wrapped up well on that end. There were still a few steps he needed to take to have the car released to him, not to mention his insurance. But before he got a chance, he felt someone frantically tap his shoulder. It was the vet. Jonathan apologized to the cops and hung up. He was a bit confused by the intense look the doctor bore on his face, but soon his curiosity would be answered. I know it's not your fault, but you made a big mistake bringing this animal in here. Jonathan felt his heart sink. Jonathan's defeated look grew even deeper as the doctor explained what was happening. It turns out the young animal was indeed in a grave situation, and there was nothing the doctor could do for it now that the illness had progressed. However, that wasn't the worst part. In its current state, the animal posed a great danger to the other animals in the clinic. The doctor explained that the animal was infected with an incredibly contagious virus to smaller mammals. Not only was it very contagious, it was also a near-fatal infection when not caught on time, which was the case the baby superglider Jonathan had found. Jonathan's eyes rounded in surprise before his brows peaked in interest. A superglider? He almost laughed at the situation. His suspicions had indeed been right, and he was, in fact, not dealing with a monkey after all. But he truly would have never guessed the baby animal was a superglider. The vet continued to explain. The virus the superglider was infected with was well known to the vet, who had been studying it for the past few weeks. It was recently widely reported in the area, and although it was most common amongst raccoons, rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, etc., were all prone to catching it. Jonathan was wary. What had he done? The doctor calmed him quickly, and he explained that they had already isolated the superglider at the back of the shop. However, the vet and Jonathan would need a new set of clothes and a shower to prevent spreading the virus to other animals. Luckily for Jonathan and the clinic staff, there was no risk of contracting the virus, as humans are immune to it. This made Jonathan feel a lot better, but the doctor explained that even after the shower protocol was that the other animals would need to be tested for safety. A few hours later, all the tests were done. The doctor returned and announced that all the animals had tested negative. Other good news came. They were going to treat the infected superglider. The day was strange and eventful. In hindsight, it was clear that he should have left the super baby glider in the forest. But at that moment, abandoning a baby animal had not seemed like the right thing to do. And even now, he was glad he had decided to try and save it. He felt a strong connection with the superglider. He wanted to make sure the superglider would survive the virus. He stayed in contact with the vet. Then a few weeks later, he got a call. It was the vet. The vet told Jonathan there was news about the superglider and that he should come to the hospital right now. Jonathan was at work, but he felt a strong urge to go to the hospital anyway. He decided to grab his bag and drive to the hospital. Not looking back, Jonathan drove to the vet as fast as he could. For some reason, he got a bad feeling. When he got to the vet, he had to wait in the waiting room. He couldn't wait and was sweating. He didn't understand why he felt this way, but he did. Then the vet walked into the waiting room. "Please come in," said the vet. Jonathan was nervous. He didn't know what to expect. The vet had a concerned look on his face. The vet looked at Jonathan, then asked him a surprising question. "Have you picked a name for the superglider?" Jonathan was slightly confused. "A name? Why would I need to pick a name?" There was a brief moment of silence. "Monkey, I would like to name him Monkey," Jonathan said. Shortly after, the door opened. The assistant walked into the room with the superglider. The doctor explained that the animal recovered from the virus and did really well. But it would never do well in the wild because it's still weak. So the doctor asked Jonathan the important question. "Will you take him home?" Jonathan was extremely happy that the animal did well. He had never cared for a superglider before, so he wasn't sure if he was the right person for it. He breathed and said to the vet, "Yes, I would like to take him home." Jonathan was overjoyed when he took the super little glider home. Monkey and Jonathan became best friends. They played a lot. Monkey became stronger and stronger. So, Jonathan decided to take him outside to play. But then something terrible happened. Monkey climbed up a tree and he was gone. Jonathan sat at the tree for hours, but no sign of Monkey. He didn't know what to do, so he just stayed there. Jonathan was sad that Monkey was gone. Was he attacked? Did he want to return home? After a few hours, Jonathan decided to go home. The next day, Jonathan returned to the tree, hoping to get a sign of Monkey. Again, a few hours passed, and he couldn't find the superglider. Jonathan again decided to head back home. But then something incredible happened. Out of nowhere, a super glider jumped out of the tree and flew around. He circled around Jonathan and eventually landed on his shoulder. He stayed on his shoulder to cuddle with Jonathan. Jonathan knew it was Monkey. They headed back home, but Jonathan felt something wasn't right. Did Monkey want to return home? Jonathan wondered if Monkey wasn't better off in the wild. Jonathan eventually got back home with Monkey. Two started playing together, and Jonathan knew this was the last day they would play together. Tomorrow, Jonathan would let Monkey return to the wild. The next morning, Jonathan brought Monkey to the nearest tree in his backyard. He said goodbye to Monkey while he climbed up the tree. After a few minutes, he was gone. Jonathan knew he had made the right decision. That evening, Jonathan decided to take a walk in the forest. Jonathan always walked through the forest on Thursday evenings. But this time, he hoped he would spot his friend Monkey. Unfortunately, he didn't spot the super glider. Jonathan walked home, hoping he would spot his friend on the way back. Then out of nowhere, he spotted something in his garden. It was Monkey. But after taking a closer look, he saw another creature. It was another super glider. It looked like they were waiting for Jonathan to take care of them. Jonathan opened his door, and they immediately ran inside. Jonathan was overjoyed, but also a bit concerned, because the other super glider might have the virus that Monkey also had. Jonathan decided to go back to the vet the next day. Again, Jonathan had to return to the vet, this time with a little more urgency and more careful. The vet decided to take action and immediately examined the super glider. Jonathan waited in the waiting room with Monkey, hoping his new friend didn't have the virus. The vet called Jonathan back into his office. He had good news. The super glider didn't have a virus. But after closer examination, the vet did notice many similarities with Monkey. That let him believe they were brother and sister. Monkey returned to the forest to help his sister. The vet asked Jonathan if he wanted to take care of both animals. Without hesitation, Jonathan said yes and brought both animals back home. They grew up very happy and healthy. Jonathan had 2 new friends to play with all his other animals. Binding bonds through beautiful tales. Thank you for watching.